you already know that pocket aces is the best starting hand you can have in Hold'em, which is great, but there's a lot of different ways to mess this hand up. And honestly, this hand can send someone on an emotional tailspin super quickly, from the elation of getting a preflop to all of a sudden postflop facing some not so great boards and not really sure when to hold on to that single pair versus when to just let it go. That's what we're going to talk about today. Let's get into the science of pocket aces. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit. Welcome back to another video in the Science of Poker series where we analyze popular starting hands from a technical point of view and give you tips for playing these hands better both pre-flop and post-flop. And today we're talking about the one starting hand where you're guaranteed to always be good, or at minimum chopping pre-flop. Of course, we're talking about pocket aces, an absolute beast of a hand pre-flop, but post-flop sometimes can be a little bit confusing to know when to hold on and when to let it go. So before we get into the hardcore technical analysis of this hand, let's start by talking about why players love and some players actually hate pocket aces. So why do players love this hand? Well, clearly it's the best starting hand in Hold'em, and that's pretty great. Number two is that it's always good enough to stack off pre-flop with in a cash game, regardless of the situation. And just for the record, in tournaments there are some spots where you should back off, and from an ICM perspective it might not be right, but just as a cash game player especially, you're never trying to find a fold with this hand pre-flop. Also, this hand flops an overpair or better 100% of the time, which is incredibly unique, and also an overpair of aces is often good enough to stack off with even post-flop, especially as that SPR starts dropping. Now, why do some players hate this hand? First, it sometimes feels like we never get any action pre-flop, and although some of this is variance, it's worth keeping in mind that we do technically get less action when holding aces due to card removal effects. Number two is that ordinary villains' value ranges of 10s plus ace king is 46 combos, whereas it drops down to only 33 combos when we actually hold pocket aces, again important to understand. And then number three is that losing is tougher when winning feels like it should almost be a foregone conclusion. Pocket aces has a tremendous amount of entitlement baked into it, both pre-flop and post-flop, and that can be a little bit tricky for players from a more mental point of view. So whether you love or hate this hand, and hopefully you love it since there's a tremendous amount of things to love about it, I think it's important to understand what to expect with pocket aces. So first and foremost, it should be obviously a huge winning hand in your database, the biggest, most winning hand overall if you have a good sample size. You should expect lots of 3-betting and 4-betting and 5-betting with this hand pre-flop, but also a little bit more pre-flop slow playing compared to a hand like pocket kings. Aces is also an ideal pre-flop slow playing candidate in theory land, since it's less likely to be outdrawn compared to other pairs or starting hands. For instance, if your opponent has ace-5 suited as a bluff, it only has 13% equity against our aces, whereas that same ace-5 suited has 33% equity against pocket kings. Now switching focus to post-flop, you should expect lots of value betting post-flop with aces and a general reluctance to fold unless the board texture is extremely bad, and you should also expect some trickier decisions with overpairs on heavily interactive boards such as 9-8-7 with a flush draw. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's jump over and do some post-flop analysis with pocket aces and real quick see how aces hits across all possible flops, and to do this we're going to use a tool called Flopzilla Pro, and right here in the center we can plug in pocket aces, see how it hits across all possible flop textures, and if we look first at smashes, which we will consider 2-pair or better, we notice that's happening 12% of the time. If we go and click in single pair hands, which is of course always going to be an overpair, there's never going to be an overcard to this hand, that's happening the other 88% of the time. And then if we also plug in draws as well, with flush draws, open-ended straight draws, and gut shots, you notice we're still at 100% hits overall, and the overall draws is going to be about 5%. All of that of course is going to be overlapped with those single pair hands. So given that, there are really only two flop scenarios when we have pocket aces. Number one is we flop an overpair with or without some sort of redraw, or number two, we completely obliterate the flop with a set or better. Alright, so with the technical analysis out of the way, what I want to do now is jump into some general tips for playing this hand better both pre-flop and post-flop. And let's start with pre-flop tips first. Tip number one is that you should always isolation raise and 3-bet with this hand given the opportunity. If there's a limp in front of you, if there's a raise in front of you, just play that spot aggressively. Don't try to get cute and limp it behind or just flat instead of 3-betting it. Just as a pure default, play these hands aggressively when isoing and 3-betting. And I know you might be thinking, well, if I 3-bet with aces, then everyone's going to fold because they always do when I 3-bet. And if that's the case, you're in a pretty cool spot where you should be 3-betting a ton of junk as well and taking advantage of your incredibly nitty image. Number 2 continues with that preflop aggression, and that is to generally just 4-bet it and 5-bet it given the opportunity as well. When in doubt, just play the hand really aggressively preflop. 3-bet it, 4-bet it, 5-bet it given the opportunity. Someone 5-bets you, 6-bet them, just as a pure default. Now, of course, it can be theoretically correct to flat call sometimes. If, say, you open, you face a 3-bet, it can be sometimes theoretically correct to just flat there or even flat a 4-bet. It's not to say that you can't ever slow play it, but you really want some reads and information first before you do it. You'll find it sometimes as well as a mix when you're looking at GTO ranges preflop, but as a pure default, just play these hands aggressively. Don't worry about trying to get cute with it, just fire away, 3-bet, 4-bet, 5-bet, go from there. Tip number 3 unshockingly continues with the preflop aggression, and that is to always 3-bet squeeze and even 4-bet squeeze given the opportunity. Even though Pocket Aces is a good slow playing candidate against a single opponent in a heads up pot, it's not nearly as good to do in a multi-way pot, and in fact something that I would suggest you completely avoid overall. I think this is where a lot of players get themselves in trouble with Pocket Aces, as they start slow playing it too much, they start putting themselves in slow play pots and multi-way pots especially, and they really get themselves in trouble. Unless you know damn well if you call here you're going to induce the aggression behind you like pretty much every single time, don't get cute with it. Again, just continue with the aggression. Save the slow playing stuff for heads up pots, not ones where there's a risk of multi-way pots building up a decent chunk of the time. And tip number 4 is painful to even have to say, but I have to say it because I hear stories about it every so often, and that is to never, ever fold aces preflop in a cash game. Ever. Don't ever fold it. I don't know why the heck people do. If you play live cash long enough, you're eventually going to hear stories like this where someone got involved in a huge pot preflop and decided to fold aces. It's really quite stupid. Please don't do this. If you're even thinking about folding aces preflop in a cash game, it's indicative that you're playing out of your role, that you're either too deep or you're just way out of your comfort zone so much that you're going to make this mistake. Please don't. You cannot come up with a situation where it is correct to fold aces preflop in a cash game. In a tournament where you have ICM considerations, yes, you can definitely come up with plenty of spots where folding aces preflop makes sense, but in a cash game, no, never. Please don't do it. Alright, so with preflop tips out of the way, let's jump over to postflop tips, and we're going to break this into 2 different sections, kind of based upon those 2 different possible boards or flops that we're going to see when we have aces. First is going to be when we have the overpair, and then we're also going to get into sections where we end up flopping that set or better. Tip number 1 is to understand how your equity is influenced when you have aces on different kinds of boards. So for instance, let's just take a spot where the button opens, you 3-bet from the big blind with pocket aces, the button decides to call you. If the board comes something like king deuce deuce rainbow, if we look at Flopzilla and pop it open, you notice right off the bat that we have 93% equity on that board against their entire range, of course. And if we switch that over to something like 9-8-7 with a flush draw on it, all of a sudden the equity of pocket aces is going to drop down to something like 66%. So you notice that on those drier boards, especially with a single high card on it, you're going to have huge equity edges overall with aces, but as that board starts getting more and more connected, all of a sudden that equity can drop off. Not in a way that you're behind necessarily, but not as thick of an equity edge as you would have had on the other texture. Tip number 2 while playing the overpair with aces is to understand spots where you need to be getting away from the hand. And again, like we mentioned, aces is as a default going to have a tremendous equity edge, but when your opponent, especially one who's a little bit tighter, then all of a sudden starts to get really aggressive on those more coordinated boards, that is typically a sign that your aces is not necessarily ahead anymore, and it might be time to start thinking about the fold button. Now, of course, the exact texture, the exact opponent type, everything is going to play a huge factor in here, but of course there are times to get away from it. It's not you have aces, you get married to it forever, you never ever fold postflop, especially when you're talking about deeper SPRs. If you're constantly stacking off every time you have aces postflop because you're getting really entitled because, well, my aces were ahead preflop, that's going to be very problematic. Again, there are definitely times and spots to get away from it, but if you're constantly fearful, you're constantly trying to find the fold button, be a little bit careful about that, especially if you're in softer or more fishy games. Don't get caught constantly overfolding with this overpair. It's just going to be a massive burn and a massive wasted opportunity. Tip number 3 with the overpair is that the SPR and how often you should be folding folding your overpair is definitely going to be correlated. So as that SPR, that stack to pot ratio, gets lower and lower, as a default you should be folding your overpair less and less, whereas the deeper the SPR, the more often you could consider correctly getting away from aces. Not that you should default get away from it, but you should definitely be more aware of that, which is why in things like 4-bet pots, usually the SPR is going to be so small you can pretty much never get away from aces as an overpair, versus in 3-bet pots there are some more opportunities too, and in single raise pots lots more opportunities to get away from your overpair, or at least not completely commit with it. But again, definitely make sure you're aware of the SPR, and if you've never really heard of this term or worked with it before, I'll leave a link in the description box for a full video, or leave one of those card things up there at the top. Tip number 4 with the overpair is that aces should be looking for 3 streets of value post-flop. So it's easy to go for 3 streets of value and the board cooperates and it's pretty uncoordinated and your opponent's really fishy and you just kind of pound, assuming the board doesn't get terrible. That's pretty simple, but overall you should even be looking to go for 3 streets of value when some draws improve. Now, you can abandon this a little bit when the board 4 straights or 4 flushes and you don't have it, fine, but overall you should definitely be looking for 3 streets of value unless, again, the worst of textures comes up, or if you face aggression from your opponent. But if they're just constantly calling you down, look for that 3rd street of value. Don't start going for bet check when there's no real reason to, again, assuming that board texture is still cooperating. And tip number 5 is to typically not fold when you have aces and you're facing a triple barrel from your opponent. Now, if you're facing a triple barrel post-flop, it means you probably just called preflop and slow played it, hopefully using the preflop tips we were talking about earlier in a correct spot to do so. And if that's the case, you do decide to slow play a preflop because you deem that spot a better slow play than a fast play, and you face 3 barrels, it's very, very difficult and usually incorrect to find that fold button. One of the reasons why you decided to flat was to keep more junk and aggression stuff in your opponent's ranges, and unless the board completely craps out on you or your opponent is just incredibly nitty and would never fire that 3rd barrel without some sort of completely nutted hand that beats you, typically just continue calling down and feel very good about it. Alright, so those are tips when playing post-flop and having the overpair with pocket aces. Now let's switch gears a little bit and actually look at spots where we completely smash the flop and flop a set or better. Tip number 1 is that when you flop this big, you should typically be in a commitment mindset. Unless the board completely craps out, and I mean like 4 straight or 4 flush, you should just be in the mindset when you have a set of kings or better, and obviously a set of aces is going to classify as hitting that. You should be in that commitment mindset and looking for ways to get your stack inside and really not trying to find the fold button at any given point. Tip number 2 is that it can be theoretically correct to start slow playing when you end up flopping top set with aces. So when you flop top set with aces, it's a situation where you typically have the board very, very locked up, right? If it comes in with like ace 7 deuce rainbow and you have top set of aces, what else can your opponent really have that's that strong that wants to give you a tremendous amount of value, right? Might be a better spot to theoretically consider going for the slow play. I mean, if we were to fire up GTO Plus and look at a spot like this, and when we give the solver a bunch of bet sizing option from a small 33% pot bet all the way up to an overbet, this is an 18 big blind pot, we give it options from 6 all the way up to 23. If we look at pocket aces and stick in here for a moment, you notice that it's largely using checking and betting the very, very small number. It never uses the pot size or even half pot or bigger options. So it's not too shocking if you ask me, but again, you notice that the solver likes some amount of checking happening in this spot. And since we're already here, let's see what the solver would do when we decide to make that small bet. Our opponent calls and a turn is, say, the queen of diamonds. They check to us, as they should be doing a tremendous amount of the time. Look at pocket aces and notice that that is a pure check, versus even things like ace king are getting fired always and have 0 checking going on at all. And that all brings us to tip number 3, which is to understand the difference between theory and exploitative. So even though the solver likes checking a turn after you bet the flop and it turns that queen of diamonds, it's still a spot where in real time, in practice, I would still suggest firing and just going for max value. Your opponent continued on the flop on such a dry texture, they probably like their hand to some extent, and why not just absolutely punish them? You have to understand that when you're looking at solver output, that it's assuming your opponent is a GTO perfect opponent and is going to play perfectly according to GTO on all future inflection points, this one and every everything going forward. And of course, your real human opponents are anything but GTO perfect, and as such you can typically bend this more toward exploitative land and just continue firing and maximizing against your opponent, who again has proven that they have something that they like, so why not punish them for it since your hand is still clearly ahead. Which brings us to the final tip when you flop that set or better, is that even if you use a smaller bet sizing option on an earlier street, you want to go for 3 streets of value, and you can use bigger bets and even over bets on turns and rivers. Don't feel like you have to go small, small, small in order to get value here. If your opponent again continues on the flop and you think it's best just to go punish, 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 make sure to use those bigger bets on turns and rivers, especially in smaller games, smaller live games, micro online games. There's tons and tons of value here. Don't feel like you have to stick to the solver, don't feel like you have to go small bets all the way through, and definitely don't feel like you have to be checking on turns and rivers when again 3 streets of value should be your primary focus. And that is the science of pocket aces. I really hope you enjoyed, hope you got something out of this, and I know we spent a lot of time on post-flop tips, and even though they could be summed up very simply as try to max value, if you're wondering how to do that, if you're really working on that part of your game, I would highly suggest checking out the post-flop workbook if you haven't already. It runs you through tons of different exercises and all of the mathematical and technical things that you need to work on that a lot of players just simply won't, and whether they're scared of it or they just simply don't know where to start, this is exactly the kind of stuff that is going to make a huge difference in your off-table study, so that way in real time, in practice, you can just draw from the general information you've already studied, and you can just skip a lot of the mental loading math that you have to do because you've kind of offloaded it to some extent. That's largely what workbooks are for, and the Postflop workbook is no exception. Of course, this is going to help you get more value out of things like Flopzilla Pro if you already own a license, or you can get the bundle that comes with the workbook plus Flopzilla Pro if you're working on analyzing and taking your game more seriously, both on and off the table. SplitSuit.com/postflop to learn more, grab your workbook, or you can also pick it up on Amazon if you prefer a paperback. But either way, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to let me know, and of course, a thumbs up on the video if you enjoyed it would be massively appreciated. Otherwise, I'll leave it here. I'll see you back shortly with a brand new video. In the meantime, good luck out there, and happy grinding.